actually asked to sort of respond and try to bring in, lessons and thoughts from other conflicts that I work on. So this is not a prepared talk, and I think it's going to be more like a discussion. But I did write down, a number of things that just stood out from what you were talking about that I think are worth considering for here, and where I can also bring in some insight, from other conflicts. So my only apology is that I have many of them in different directions. It's not, like a structured thing. One thing that stood out to me is the value when you were saying or I guess you were saying of not necessarily looking at the endpoint, but understanding that the process itself can contribute to the better endpoint, right? The de-escalation rather than the Big Bang theory. We have problems with that here because I think in our case there's actually contrast, and I do think that comparisons are useful not only because they may be similar, but also because of where they're different. So I think it's just as valuable to look at other conflicts for understanding what can be different, just because we learn from that. And one of the contrasts here is that there's been a sense that the process is becoming the problem here. That in our case, the process is not leading to any of these kinds of confidence-building measures that advance an end goal, but it's becoming essentially an obstacle or holding political situation in place while the situation on the ground becomes worse. So that's a contrast. Now, when you talk about confidence-building measures, or again, I can't remember, I'm mixing who said what, but confidence-building measures, I think, were for a very long time a fixture of negotiating techniques, right? I think every policy person involved in negotiations has the CBM, right? Confidence-building measures somewhere in their plans. And something that I've started to feel, again, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict context, is that it's becoming a little bit empty of meaning. And then that made me, what I thought about was when you, I think, were saying humiliation is the root of all terror. I really agree with that statement. I think that holds true for every conflict that I've worked on where there's, terror, guerrilla, freedom-fighting, violent activity. And I wonder if we can think instead of confidence-building measures about dehumiliation efforts or restore respect measures, restore dignity measures. I mean, focusing on that angle. So not so much to make a symbolic change of like, hi, we're trying to generate confidence, but making any changes on the ground that allow people to just feel more like people. And I think that is what, again, I know I haven't brought in other conflicts yet, but I'm still thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian situation in that context. We talk about, I liked also the point that you put together, that you said about implementing an agreement may be harder than getting to an agreement, which I very much agree with. And where we are here in this region is in a phase that we call conflict management. Why don't we have peace management? There's a lot of policy effort going into thinking about conflict management because our government here is convinced that we can do it. I'm not. I think the Palestinians are not. Many Israelis are, but I disagree. So I think that we're not at the stage of the peace process yet, but when we do get there, the process in itself will be dangerous. We have a history of violence during peace processes here, sometimes worse than what preceded them. And I think we should be thinking about processes to put into place for managing the peace, whether it's during the process or afterwards. I thought I would turn a little bit to the actual topic of bringing extremism, bringing extremist groups into a peace process, because that is one of the key factors that went on in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it is going to be one of the key factors going on here, and it has been in some of the other conflicts I work on. I think particularly about Kosovo. Anybody here is familiar with the Balkans? A little bit? Okay, well, you remember there were some big wars there in the 90s, right? And that President Clinton, it also occurred to me, was probably taking some risks for Northern Ireland. My guess is that he was starting to feel desperate after a series of failures, or what was perceived as failures in the Balkans, although there was the Dayton Accords in 1995. But there was a lot of criticism of what had happened in the early 90s, and probably he was willing to take a few risks if he thought that it was reasonable to reach peace. But anyway, Kosovo, I will not go into a whole lecture, but a small piece of Serbia. Yugoslavia was breaking up. Kosovo wanted their independence from Serbia. The Serbs said, no way, you are our Jerusalem, right? The heart of our religion, our culture is all in this area. You will never get it from us. And the Kosovars said, if you sort of cancel our semi-autonomy, they had a little bit of autonomy, we will fight back. They provoked the Serbs violently repressed them, and boom, all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, but at a certain point you had a guerrilla group. I call it a guerrilla group only because the US State Department called them a guerrilla group. And there had been more political leadership there, but this guerrilla group eventually became much more credible in the eyes of their people. So that by the time negotiations came around to try to stave off a war, which didn't work, but by the time there were formal negotiations led by the international community between Kosovo and Serbia, the international community looked at the Serbs and said, but you have two leaderships. Does that sound familiar? You have two leaderships. You have a divided leadership. You have this political leadership that claims that they've won these elections that you've held under occupation, what they call an occupation. And then you have this violent group that is claiming a lot of political credibility. What are we supposed to do with that? Well, they brought them both to the negotiations. They said, we know we're not going to have the legitimacy of the rest of the Kosovar people until we bring them both. So they brought them both. And why did the guerrilla group agree to join? Why would they do something like that? Well, I think that they saw political power in their sights. And I guess the thing to remember is that extremist groups have rational interests like every other political actor. And we don't like their tactics, but they are rational choices to use those tactics. And then the other parallel I was thinking about with relation to that aspect is what happened afterwards. Okay, there was the negotiations failed, there was a big war. Probably people remember the NATO intervention in 1999, shortly after the Good Friday Accords. And that guerrilla group, okay, it was called the KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, was essentially transformed into the future Kosovo police force. Many of them eventually became integrated into political life. Not everybody is happy about this, right? Many forces, certainly the left and liberal forces, are not happy about it. But why would they sort of go civil? Like move from the political, the sort of violent margins to increasingly transforming their mode of political expression to political and diplomatic modes rather than violence? Well, I think that there was a sense that they had achieved what they wanted, which was massive international intervention on their behalf. And I say that not because I want massive international violent intervention in this country, in this region, but I do think that when an organization sees that it is getting rewarded politically, that its political demands are being met, it shouldn't shock anybody that they have a lot of incentive to make themselves more accommodating. And I think that's something that we need to understand about violent groups, even if we despise and deplore the methods. I have so many more points, and I don't want to monopolize the microphone, but I will just say one more thing that has nothing to do with, well, it does have to do with the extremist groups. And that's about religious leadership, because you raised it. Obviously, I remember when I first started looking into Northern Ireland, I came away with the impression that, like you said, that it wasn't really about religion, it was really about political claims and all sorts of historic, political, and current conditions and class and all these things. But religion was a factor. Here, in some ways, it can be hard to tell. Here, I think, the more I do, and I primarily do public opinion research about the conflict here, that's my expertise. I think the more I live and research here, the more I realize that it is a religious conflict. And I don't just mean religious like two religions don't agree or two religions want to own Temple Mount or the land in the West Bank. What I mean is that whether you are religious or secular, certainly on the stronger side in this conflict, which is the Israeli side, is almost completely determines your political perspective. In other words, if this country were only secular people, there would be a strong majority for reaching a two-state solution and a stable majority for decades already. There would be a strong majority for making all the concessions needed for a two-state solution. Never mind if you believe in a two-state solution for now, I'm just saying as an example. Okay. And that has been very consistent, and it's still that way today, even if there's been some drop-off. The more religious the groups in Israeli society are, so if you're even traditional, not secular, but traditional, you are almost the opposite, already really edging away. There's probably a majority against the two-state solution. And the more religious you are, if you're national religious, you are almost 90% of that community is against either the two-state solution or the concessions. I will qualify that a little bit, it's a nuance. I often see that there are maybe about a third of the religious community who is prepared for some sort of concession and dialogue, and maybe even in the right circumstances a two-state solution. But it's a completely your religious outlook completely determines your attitudes in this conflict. I don't have the same level of breakdowns on Palestinian public opinion. I will say that in the Palestinian-Israeli community, so those who are Israeli citizens, how religious you are is not as clear a determination of your political views, but I think that they're distinct. I think they are distinct on that aspect from West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. So the conclusion of that is not just that we have to resolve who owns the Temple Mount, but that if people insist that their religious sensibilities, their personal spirituality is inevitably linked to their political platform, we will never end the conflict here. And the only people who can change that are religious people. Which is why I can only concur very strongly with your conclusion that they have to be brought into the process. And again, to draw on other conflicts I'm familiar with, there are many where the clergy have not played that role, have played rather an escalating role. So I mean, the other conflict that I think about a lot is Cyprus, which, with the help of the big guy or girl, will be resolved soon. Maybe, I mean, it's very hard to know, but they're having negotiations right now all the time this November. As they have been for about over a year now. And historically, the church, the Orthodox Church on the Greek side has not played a very conciliatory role. It has generally been an arena for escalating nationalist rhetoric. And that is the case in a lot of countries. And I think that one time, not so long ago, I had a visiting group of clergy that I was speaking to, Christian clergy from the US, and I gave my talk about, sort of 101 on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and public opinion dynamics, and they said, so, can you tell me more about the role of religion? I mean, it seems like if there's so many religious people here, there should be a lot of peace-oriented people. And I said, oh, how am I going to break this to you? Yeah. But it does reinforce the point that, unfortunately, too often religion here is not only linked to hardline attitudes, but actually the extremist attitudes. So it's not a one-for-one overlap, but it would be wise not to talk about just extremism without addressing the religious aspect of it. And my conclusion, unlike sometimes, some things you hear in the liberal camp here, which I'm very much against, is, oh, it's terrible, the number of religious people is growing, and therefore we're going to have an illiberal and a hardline society. I resent that attitude. I think it's a wrongful attitude. This is not about people being religious. I don't see religious people as a demographic threat. I think nobody should. I think people should be free to live however they want, and I'm not scared of religious people in my society, but I do think that if we are committed to resolving conflicts, we will need to de-link personal religious spirituality from political platforms that probably contradict what their very religion stands for.